Thank you. Thank you very much.
When we, among the things we discussed when we discussed climate finance is what should be the shares of grants, concessional finance, and commercial finance. And the reason we need to do that is because there are certain activities relating to mitigation, adaptation, particularly adaptation, loss and damage, which cannot yield returns and therefore have to be funded through grants because you can't fund them through credit. So when it comes to countries which are most vulnerable and also which have difficulties of structural transformation, I mean, you can't have, if you're an island economy, you can't become a manufacturing power so easily. Should our concern be with saying that, listen, we are being penalized because of the fact that there's a risk associated with it, or to argue that, listen, given where we are located in this and our own, absence of responsibility but complete susceptibility, that we should be given grants. Everything should be funded by the international community with grants.
Thanks, Emma, again, Krishna. My question's to Shafiq as well. Congratulations on the paper. I think it's actually potentially really useful for some of the ongoing negotiations on the NCQG. And I say that because just thinking back, the recent negotiations on the loss and damage fund, where arguably the common but differentiated responsibilities principle should be strongest, right? The US was very explicit there that when they were talking about where the sources of financing should be coming from, that it isn't based on any type of debt or reparation or anything like that, right? And so this type of work can be really useful in the ongoing negotiations now for 2025. So I'm just very practical question, whether you're sharing your work with especially advocacy groups who are pushing the NCQG discussions, and if not, I'd be really happy to help connect you. Thanks.
Yes, I have some comments for Fatima. I have some comments for the one thing that you pointed, I think, in one of the first slides, which is very important, and we have not emphasized enough, is a contradiction. In contradiction between the fact that some economies that are developing economies are considered, on the one hand, high-income economies. There's no difference between the Bahamas and Belgium when it comes to the World Bank concessional lending. And on the other hand, they are charged as low-income countries. And because credit rating agencies, this I know for a fact, they compare some of these countries with low-income countries. So when it comes to giving, you are a high-income country. When it comes to charging, you are a low-income country. And I think that's a big contradiction. The second comment that I wanted to make, and has to do with the Maldives also, is the balance of payments, the current account deficit of SIDS, which is huge. I don't see any country, for example, big economy, Latin America, Colombia or Peru or Mexico, having the current account imbalance that SIDS can support. That can support with, for example, in the Maldives, with a fixed exchange rate regime. And yet that implies, in a case, for example, the Maldives, a decline in reserves relative to imports, which is going to worsen when you have to import in order to try to do a structural transformation, because imports and investments are highly related. So I think part of the proposal should be that the current account imbalance has to be reduced. It's not only a problem of finance, it's also a problem of exports. The last question I wanted to ask, how is the Asian Development Bank helping in all of this? Thank you.
Hi, just a comment to Siobhan. I know I've seen the data about green finance or green energy finance overcoming fossil fuel finance last year, but the picture actually is somewhat more nuanced because most of the lending for green energy finance was granted to fossil fuel companies. For instance, RWE, which is the largest energy company in Germany, and there is a Bloomberg article on this. I'm mentioning a lot of this. Exxon, I think, also got a lot of green lending. So that's something to perhaps to mention in your work.
Thanks, all of you, for excellent discussions. So I wanted to bring up 2 points that apply across. One is on the treatment of de-risking and where we set hierarchies with respect to levels of de-risking. This kind of connects to what Chandra just mentioned. We have the 3 broad categories of grants: subsidized credit or concessional credit, or de-risking, and commercial credit. So under what conditions should we and how do we assess the extent to which we are going to be favorable to de-risking? I mean, I get the sense a lot of people use de-risking as kind of a dirty word, but it's all we're talking about is subsidizing credit. And I think back to Alice Amsden's classic work on developmental state, and the development banks, according to Amsden, is absolutely front and center, critical to the advancement of the developmental state, and that basically was a form of de-risking. It was subsidizing private capital under very strict conditions. I want to understand what people think about that. Then on the credit rating agencies, I wasn't clear whether the problem, or maybe it's both to some extent, whether the problem is that the private credit rating agencies have a built-in austerity bias, or they're just stupid. They're wrong. They're making bad assessments. We know in the 2007-2008 crisis, the credit rating agencies were just really stupid. They completely missed the magnitude of the building crisis. So in that sense, an exercise that we might think of is, okay, if we should institute a public credit rating agency, what would it do differently in terms of its assessment of 100% private absorbed commercial risk? Would it be that different? And if it isn't that different, then the challenge would therefore be, if we understand the nature of the risks, then we build in the features of de-risking that will advance both the mitigation and the adaptation financing at the scale required.
Thank you. Siobhan, I'm not sure about your statistical correlation between fossil fuel production and debt distress. Because if you look at empirical examples, my own country, when you discover reserves of fossil fuels, you became creditworthy. And this could lead governments to, increase their debts in foreign currency before even you start to exploit, the fossil fuels. This is the case of my country. We have not yet started to exploit oil and gas, but we knew that we had these reserves, 10 years ago. And now we have something like 80% debt GDP ratio, sovereign debt GDP ratio, and most of the debt is in foreign currency. So I think the correlation could run, both sides. You see, it's not just that because you are in debt distress that you start, to increase. I'm not sure about that. If you take, for example, another case, the case of Niger, the West said, I will not lend to you money. I know you're a landlocked country. It's really difficult. But as you are rather aligned with Russia, we won't lend you money. But they will start to exploit oil and gas But before starting oil and gas, I mean, they have contracts with the Chinese. The Chinese said, we could lend you the money because the West doesn't want to lend you the money. You see, for example, this year they will have, they borrow 400 million to China. They will have to pay 7% for just 1 year. So you could have, the coalitions could run, both sides. About Fatima, I think I would go the way Shandu frames it. For the small island development states, in terms of policy agenda, should we not just say that the external debt should be cancelled and the climate issue should be a global issue, not something that has to be dealt with by these small nations, because obviously they don't have the resource to do that. And no amount of, credit, even if at zero interest rate, will help them. So isn't it, the way to say we have just to cancel the external debt and have kind of unilateral and unconditional transfers? Shuvik, about the taxing, because I see two important things you said about how we could, finance this global ecology transition. You say in the, rich countries, the level of taxation needed, is very low, 0 point something. And that could be done. But other thing you say also is that if you want to achieve this ecological transition, we have also to tax the rich. And I'm thinking that whether we could dissociate the two, in the sense that, for example, if you look at, those countries which are responsible for historical emissions are those who are monetarily sovereign. Those countries whose currencies are held as reserve assets by the central banks. For example, if you look at the IMF so-called COFA database, currency composition of official exchange reserves, these countries, account for more than 80% of all reserves accumulated by central banks. And this is also linked with the issue of SDRs in the sense that most of the SDRs are allocated to these countries. So can we have a way to finance that with, let's say SDRs or things like that without linking that with taxing the wealthy, in the global north, because that could be a sensitive political issue. And if we have really to tax the rich, I think we have to tax them really hard, something like, for example, 50%, 60%, or take all. If we really want to curb, the footprint of the rich. So the question I'm asking in terms of political strategy, should we dissociate the two? Because for me, these are two different things. Financing something and making sure that we are curbing inequalities, class inequalities, but also inequalities in terms of ecological footprint.
Yes, we'll go in the same order.
Thank you for the questions. So the first question, I'm not surprised because there's even film projects that are labeled as climate finance as well in the book. So I'm not surprised that a lot of green finance goes to like fossil fuel company and stuff like that, because clean energy is broadly defined. Abatement, efficient use of fossil fuel can also be categorized as clean energy. So I'm not surprised as that. But yeah, thanks for letting me know. Regarding the question Bob asked about de-risking, no, this is a project I'm somewhat working on adjacently. One of my dissertation essay regarding central bank using monetary tool to stabilize food prices, particularly in Jamaica because of the drought issue. That's somewhat de-risking because one of the tools of the central bank could use is make capital cheaper for loans, capital cheaper for commercial banks so that they can give loans to farmers, but I think it has to be targeted. So for instance, in the case of Jamaica, if you're going to categorize it as de-risking, it has to be in the sense of targeting agricultural mitigation and adaptation for to prevent price shocks, food price shocks in the economy, because we're having issues with food prices increasing dramatically. I think 13% for last year because of the drought and water crisis that island states are facing in the Caribbean. So I'm not sure if I would label it de-risking because it's probably not politically feasible, but it's a tool that I think central banks can be more active in mobilizing green finance, particularly in developing countries, small island developing states, and working in tandem with development banks and regional development banks, which the Caribbean has as well. Yeah. Regarding causation, so the analysis wasn't causation. It's not a causal test. It's statistical association or statistical significance. If I were to measure causation, I'll probably use a diff and diff type stuff or Green's causality. So it's not. I'm not saying that fossil fuel production. Increasing fossil fuel production causes an increasing debt service or the other way around. I'm saying that in order to service external debt, low income and lower middle income country exploit their resources, often fossil fuel resources, in order to earn foreign exchange revenue to service this debt. Now, I did highlight that it is a symbiotic relationship where because they have oil, because they discover some sort of fossil fuel, creditors are more likely to give them external credit, and that allows them to borrow more, and therefore servicing debt becomes a cycle, basically. So they have oil, they have access to cheaper credit, now they have to exploit that oil to service the debt. So it's basically a conversation between the two variables, and that's why I did not only highlight the regressions in the two models, but also alternative as well, where I did say that when countries go to Suriname, a Dutch Caribbean country in South America, when their last credit agreement, the two creditors literally tied the debt to the resource extraction, 30% up until 2050. So yeah, so I'm not arguing causation. That will take a lot more out of the paper to really say it's an association, statistical association. And another thing that we should consider, that debt, reducing debt or eliminating debt is also a part of the strategy in climate stabilization within developing countries. Yeah.
Thank you for the questions. When it comes to SIDS, yes, I agree. I think we have to have grants. The reason why I talked about creditworthiness and sovereign risk is because the paper I'm writing is on the SRMI project, which includes more than the SIDS, right? And I think it's a useful instrument or a concept to think about what you do, like in Dunga, we were talking about this, what you do after you get a debt reduction or cancellation, right? You can't be stuck in the same cycle where you have high cost of capital and borrow and get into more debt, but more to think about why these countries are seen as such high risk and why they kind of go through these cycles of high cost of capital and debt distress and so forth. And so I think it just kind of turns our gaze to a more systemic level of analysis to think about what else needs to change, right? In terms of, thank you, Esteban, for your comments. Yeah, the problem of the current account deficit is really visceral and I think very deeply felt in the SIDS. I know that during COVID, for example, Maldives would have, defaulted if it weren't for India, right? Support from India. And the thing is, the Maldives, the primary industry is the tourism industry, which is the main FX generator, right? But most of that money doesn't even come into the country because the booking agencies are outside the country, right? So, the deficit just keeps growing. And in the meantime, we have to import food, fuel, and luxury items to cater to the tourism industry. In terms of the ADB, I know that there are facilities, just like the World Bank has, in terms of financing huge infrastructure projects, but the ones that I'm aware of, at least in the case of the Maldives, are very much led by the World Bank. And one interesting case that I looked at, where we had a project for solar plants in the Maldives, the investors wouldn't commit unless the central bank provided an FX guarantee, right, so that they could repatriate profits. And this was the same in the case of Ethiopia with the World Bank project, and the same in the second phase of SRMI for Ethiopia, where it's the only country actually that has an FX guarantee for the project. Yeah, in terms of de-risking, I think it's obviously a very interesting concept, and the developmental states de-risked, right? I think perhaps one difference would be that they were able to discipline through regulatory mechanisms. Maybe we don't see that kind of discipline here. That would be one difference, like who's in the driver's seat, right? Setting kind of the goals of the investment and what should be achieved. So I would say, I think that de-risking is a sustainable strategy, would be one where you have the goals, where the goals are set by the public, right, and democratically, and not led by kind of profit incentives. Because when you look at cases of South Korea and Taiwan, I mean, a lot of these industries weren't really generating a profit for a very long time, right? At least that's my understanding of those countries, right? They kind of defied comparative advantage. So, yeah, so that, I think, in terms of credit rating agencies, I think that, yes, the austerity bias, and I'm sure Bhumika will talk about this too, is problematic. And I think, I mean, the reality is that if you have countries that can generate economic growth, I mean, eventually you would get a better credit rating, right? I mean, this is, if you get the policy space to do something, right, build institutions, build economic growth, and it's just that that space is not even available, right? Because you get marked down if you borrow and your public debt is increasing. So I'm sure there are models out there, right, that can account for this. And bring down the cost of capital for these countries.
Thank you for your questions. I'll first go to the last question, which is directly addressed to me. About this issue of SDRs and the foreign exchange rate accumulated bias, and I have no disagreement if this can be done through the SDRs and all. But at the same time, I also don't want to do away with this concept of wealth and wealth tax. Let me present to you statistics. 735 US billionaires over the last 6 years made almost $3 trillion. Out of which, if you make the simple statistics, 6.5 billion per year. Just by waking up, nobody can, as Professor Jim Boyce said in his interview recently, nobody can make that money by working. There is no salary like that. They just wake up, their investments, they inherit, they make that money each year. Out of that, if we just, only the 735 billionaires in the US, if you just tax 10%, you get that 480 number. You don't have to tax the whole of the United States or the middle class or the poor working class. This issue is not about, I think, not about the nation. It's about a global reach, which is exploiting the resources, is responsible for this phenomenon of climate change. Historically, those global reach are located in the advanced countries. They should take up more responsibilities. Even in these newly emerging economies, there are, and remember, these numbers which I showed is only helping 50% of that finance. The rest has to come from these countries, from these poorer countries. And there also those rich people can be taxed or some resource can be generated. And that's why I am open to all ideas which eventually protects the poor, who are the vulnerable, and taxes the rich, wherever they are. And just to know about the advocacy groups, I really don't have any context or anything. I just work in a small office down this earth. I would be happy to connect, and I have no problem. Thank you.
I really appreciate the nuancing of de-risking. I think it's such an important conversation, and with the World Bank, with its evolution roadmap now really centering de-risking as its new institutional agenda. I think the key thing to remember is that the developmental state de-risked their national private sector, their national sectors and industries. With the East Asian examples and a lot of what Alice Amsden wrote about was very much a national context of de-risking. De-risking in and of itself is an act of the developmental state, and it doesn't necessarily have a specific value ascription. I think the challenge with de-risking in today's context of incentivizing private investment and private capital for the green transition, in the words of the World Bank's Evolution Roadmap, is that it is de-risking foreign and international investors. And the way in which it is de-risking international investors through the hedging exchange rate volatility, which of course is then related to the international monetary system and the kind of tightening we see, it's very much out of the autonomy of most developing countries, or the first loss position, the co-equity arrangements. These sorts of mechanisms then drastically reduce policy space for developing countries and their sovereignty in arranging the kind of green transition that fits national needs, right? Because you're servicing the needs of private investors and private capital. In terms of multilateral credit rating agencies, I think the first thing, of course, I would agree that CRAs, the rating agencies, have been implicated in all the financial crises. Asian financial crises, they exacerbated the capital flight out of the East Asian countries. During global financial crisis, they absolutely did not see the mortgage crisis. They vastly underestimated it. In fact, it's been critiqued that it's a bunch of pseudo experts sitting in Wall Street that are having undue influence. So I mean, the first thing is to break through the monopoly. Break through the monopoly. There's absolutely no competition. So it's a matter of competition and the stranglehold of third party and independence, and then the conflict of interest with the sort of incestuous relationship between the finance industry and the rating reporters. That's a huge step. One of the things that within the UN General Assembly, an ongoing discussion has been on key steps that can be taken by national authorities to reduce references to rating agencies in their legislation and regulation on both national and regional levels. So, that's sort of an interesting, and then also connecting it to the full and fair representation of developing countries in norm setting and code formulating bodies. The UNCTAD proposal also goes through some key things that the public CRA would, or the public rating agency would be doing differently. And one of the interesting things that it proposes is the criterion, linking criterion to how productive sectors and industries are contributing to social provisioning of goods and services, how they're contributing to the national tax base, and thus the revenues to service national debts. So not just to look at the blank indicators on the government level, but also the productive sector and its social and economic provisioning. Another one is, of course, the social reproductive economy, completely missing, of course, and then how well the country is able to satisfy human needs, of course, human development indexes. So the criterion is so narrow. It's just a vast range of fixes that would be needed.
Wow.